that would be a good move for him.
Yeah.
I don't know who's really the front runner. Megan is a pretty,
Yeah.
she's a good lawyer
I've
too.
worked with her too, yeah.
This is Karen.
Got a whole crew up there.
Yeah. Well, we got new appointees, don't we?
Yeah.
So even though we're not doing yours, yeah. So we're just kind of just so she gets a general idea. Maybe I need to get one for board meeting.
It's quite the group there. It's quite the group up there.
What do we have these new people? Are they like real estate developers or?
So, Pat, she used to work in Public Works. She worked in Public Works. And she was Lansing. So she was Mike's assistant for the longest time over at Public Works.
Oh, okay.
And then she's retired. And then the one, I think she's in real estate, but I'm not sure. And then Craig Powers is, he's with the radio station down in Bullhead.
Oh,
I
okay.
think he's with, I don't know which one. He's with one of the radio stations.
Yep.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the July 10th, 2019 Planning and Zoning Commission workshop to order. There will be no matters from the public that will be discussed at this meeting today, as it is a workshop providing for information and discussion only. If you would, please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Abbott,
Present.
Commissioner Jacks,
Present.
Commissioner Kelly,
Present.
Commissioner Meal, Commissioner Morse,
Present.
Commissioner Powers, Commissioner Walker, Commissioner Alexander,
Present.
Commissioner Gillette,
Present.
Chairman Gordon.
Present.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Thank you. First of all, today I'd like to introduce two new commissioners that are joining us. First of all, from District 4, Patricia Alexander. Welcome. Thank you. And from District 5, Luana Gillette. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'd like to personally recognize both of them and tell them how much I appreciate them serving. This is the first time our board's been filled since I've been back on it this
It
last
has.
4 years.
Yes.
And this one on the right, I've known Patricia for many years, and I've known Pat Alexander a lot longer. So she brings a lot to this board, and she's going to be a real asset, as I'm sure the other lady will be.
Thank you for those comments. Yes, welcome. We look forward to having you on the commission. First of all, today I need a motion to approve the meeting minutes from June 12th.
Second motion.
A motion by Commissioner Jacks, second by Commissioner Abbott. Those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item is the call to the public. If there's anyone in the public today that wishes to address the commission, please come forward. Seeing none, we'll close the call to the public and we'll move into our workshop today. Mr. Walsh, I think you're going to start and address how we're going to do this today.
Chairman Gordon, Commissioners, thank you very much. We had an interesting occurrence. We didn't have any new applications come in for our deadline for this meeting. So we looked at, a possibility of what we could do for this meeting, and we've worked with our attorney, Bob Taylor, and he's actually put together pretty good discussion points, which has been sent out to the commission. But basically, what we're looking to do is have kind of a discussion on open meeting law. Basically, a lot of the items that you'll all be faced with as we go through your service on the commission. So again, I want to also reiterate the comments already. We appreciate all of you that are serving, and it's exciting to see such a large group up on the stand there, and we appreciate all of you participating in the commission, and look forward to working with each one of you. With that, I'll turn the discussion over to our attorney, Bob Taylor, and like I said, this is intended to be a workshop and more of a discussion. So Bob even asked, he says, please don't make me just read all of this. So, if you have any questions, please feel free to stop us as we go, and we'll be happy to go into details on any of these. So thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Gordon, members of the commission. This, as Tim said, this is a workshop, so we can't discuss anything that you might ultimately take action on. This is basically an orientation session. I know there are several of you that are new to the commission. I think most of you are familiar with basic, the way that open government works and stuff. So a lot of this, you may already know, but and the format I would like to take is more of a discussion. You can bring up questions, suggestions, anything like that as we go along. But I will kind of follow the written material that I put together. So with that in mind, welcome to for the new members, welcome to the Planning and Zoning Commission. The Planning and Zoning Commission has been established pursuant to ARS 11802 to act as an advisory capacity to the Board of Supervisors in matters relating to development of the county. Your purpose in land use decisions is to promote the public health, safety, convenience, and general welfare in formulating a recommendation to the board in matters relating to planning and zoning, subdivision platting, rules and regulations, and ordinances applying to the development of land in Mojave County. The Commission's focus is limited to land use planning and development. A lot of times, particularly during a call to the public, you may get information or requests, to take action that doesn't really relate to land use planning. That would probably be referred on to whatever department would handle those sort of matters. But you're certain we do welcome call to the public. You can listen to the the people that present during the call to the public. You cannot take action during a call to the public. As an advisory body, the Commission performs both legislative and administrative functions, and there's a distinction. The most important thing about the distinction between those two types of function is legislative action can be subject to a referendum. The voters can, with the proper petitioning and stuff, submit that to the greater citizenry for a vote on any legislative action taken. Administrative action refers to action that can be performed administratively. A lot of it's done by staff. There is some involvement by Planning and Zoning Commission in administrative action. Generally, the distinction is legislative action refers to the enactment of policy or a change in existing policy, whereas administrative action refers to the implementation or execution of existing policy. As some examples of legislative action, there's the general plan. ARS 11804 provides that the Commission is instrumental in formulating and recommending a comprehensive plan for adoption by the Board of Supervisors. We did this a revision. It's been nearly 10 years now, I'd say, so we'll probably be going through it again here shortly, where we go through the entire general plan and make revisions and recommended revisions. It's usually done with a committee and staff, and I've been involved in it a couple of times now, where we go through the general plan, update it, and submit it to the Board of Supervisors. The purpose of the general plan is to provide basically a comprehensive roadmap for development. There are goals and directives in the general plan, such as conservation of open space, assurance that there's adequate property that's reserved for development, adequate property for the different types of housing to promote, a broad range of housing, and also to promote economic activity. The general plan, and a lot of times the goals and policies in a general plan will conflict with each other, and the job of the commission and the Board of Supervisors is to weigh and balance those goals and policies in the general plan to come up with the appropriate action. An amendment to the general plan, which you guys see frequently when someone proposes a zoning change that is not consistent with the existing general plan. It involves weighing and balancing goals and policies, accommodating the landowner's desire for the use of the property, considering what the neighbors feel. And it's definitely a legislative decision. And keep in mind that the commission's goal and purpose is as an advisory body. The ultimate legislative decision is taken by the Board of Supervisors. So any legislative action you take in connection with the general plan or even a rezone it would go to the Board of Supervisors. It wouldn't be, your recommendation wouldn't be subject to referendum, but the Board of Supervisors' decision would.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it comes under legislative action for changing of the existing policies.
Right.
We get our report from planning and zoning. They put things in their recommendations, why to accept, reject, and so forth. I'd just like for you to comment on how much do we depend on what P&Z gives us for the information we receive? How much should we, as commissioners, depend on that?
Well, my experience with all of planning and zoning staff is that they are very knowledgeable about the applicable ordinances and the state law, and they're very thorough in putting together their agenda packets and their recommendation. As I understand their recommendation, it's usually, and maybe Tim can help me out here now, because it does cause some confusion. When you get a proposal for a change of zoning and it says, staff recommends approval subject to
Right.
the following conditions, I don't think that is a qualitative statement on their part that this is a good thing and you should do it. I think it says if you are inclined to recommend this change or this zoning action, it should be subject to the following conditions, so that when your recommendation goes to the board, it has the conditions that are required under the zoning ordinance or the land division regulations or the state statutes. Sometimes that's, I've had it heard in court where, that a decision not to grant a zoning, a decision not to grant a requested zoning as viewed even by the judge as saying, but your staff recommended that you granted it. It does cause some confusion, but I don't think that it's a recommendation on the part of staff that this goes forward. That's not their really their duty. I think it's more of a statement that if you are inclined to grant this zoning request, it should be subject to the following conditions.
One of the things that I was in on doing the general plan, but it still gets very confusing when we get things that come before us changing the general plan. And I don't think we as commissioners can be expected to know that general plan like Tim does or Christine Ballard. She knows it. So I feel confidence in what I'm asking you, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on what you
If I might be able to add a little bit to it, staff's role in this is to basically take the application in, look at the data that's been provided, the location, what's being proposed, and basically what we do is we take that information that's been provided to us, and we compare that to the zoning ordinance, we compare that to the land division regulations, we compare it to the general plan, and basically we look at it kind of as a systematic approach. Okay, does it meet the requirements of this? Check that box. Does it meet this requirement? Check that box. And basically we take more of a systematic approach to it, and we provide a professional opinion as far as, yes, this meets these requirements, no, this doesn't meet these requirements. But as far as whether, and I guess try and find the right wording for this, but whether this change is a good idea or it's something that the county should pursue, that's where it starts to lean upon the commission and then the board for those recommendations. So from a staff standpoint, we're looking, okay, does it meet the requirements and the intent of the zoning ordinance or the general plan? And when we present it to you, we say, okay, it checks these boxes, and because it checks all these boxes, we recommend approval. Now, granted, we do go, it's more than just checking boxes. We look at the intent and what was the board's intent when they adopted the zoning ordinance or the land division regulations, and does this proposed project meet that intent? We try and provide that information, but beyond that, then we make that recommendation of, yes, it does meet this requirements, or no, it doesn't meet these requirements, and then we present it to you all to make your recommendation to the board. I hope that helps. I don't know if that makes sense in that light.
And I think a good example of that recently in one of the last couple meetings, we had a general plan change and a zoning change request that, back to your comment about the general plan too, about hard for all of us to really fully understand it, but there also is some overlap and some gray area when you compare the general plan to the area plans and to the zoning ordinance. And what that results sometime when we saw that in that recent action is, yes, technically when you look at, you can justify the fact that that general plan change could happen because of what's going on around it. You can justify that because it meets those requirements. You can check those boxes. And I've, in my experience, have appreciated the thoroughness of that, because at the end of the day, I think that's something I was going to bring up anyway for this commission and for the new members. Sometimes we get caught up in the emotion of the conversation, and it leads into discussion about things that are really outside of the purview of this commission, where at the end of the day, we're here to make a decision or a recommendation, not a decision, but a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors based on really the zoning ordinance and the general plan and the couple of items that we really are supposed to stick to in order to make our decisions. But in that example I bring up, staff's recommendation was to potentially support, or they recommended approval and to support those actions. But when we looked at it as a commission and looked at, how much that change was impeding into surrounding residential zoning districts and stuff, while you could justify it, this commission made the decision that it was a little too, it imposed a little too much on the surrounding neighborhoods. So I appreciate the thoroughness of the review. It's very straightforward, black and white, by the ordinances that are in place. That gives us the tools to try and apply that. And sometimes, in a lot of cases, we tend to go along with that recommendation because it is thorough and it is by the book, so to speak. But there certainly are areas where it's not black and white, and that's where we have to step in and make that judgment call to recommend one way or the other.
Mr. Chairman?
What?
Can I make a comment?
Yes, go ahead.
I really believe it's an excellent check and balance system. The staff provides their opinion, give it to us. We as commissioners provide our opinion and move it on to the Board of Supervisors. They make the ultimate decision. So it's a great check and balance system. And as you pointed out, Chairman Gordon, on one issue, last meeting, the Board of Supervisors actually reversed one of our decisions. So it's a
They
great,
actually, they actually reversed it, I think, the portion as it was, but they put a stipulation in there couldn't be any mobile homes,
good.
which was good.
So my point is, it's a great check and balance system, and I'm really happy with it.
Well, think of it as, this is illustrative of the difference between administrative action and legislative action. Staff's action in putting together its recommendation and agenda packet and reviewing the statutes and putting the necessary conditions, that's more of an administrative act. Legislation requires the use of discretion, and that's, the staff puts together the recommendation, then you guys make the legislative recommendation. You've been chosen from your respective districts because of your knowledge of the type of development. You've grown up and lived in your districts for a while. You know how, the real estate is working and stuff in the different districts. So you're bringing a different perspective to the table, and a necessary perspective, your knowledge of the area. And there you have discretion to use that knowledge in making your recommendation to the board. The staff doesn't, although they're very familiar with the county, they don't have, the presence in in each specific of your respective jurisdictions that you do. They don't have that perspective, so.
Yeah. It's a good point, and something I'd like to add to that especially for the new commissioners, but also to remind everyone, we're in such a large and diverse county here, and it's important that we have 2 commissioners from each district. And before I was commissioner, and even more so now, I relied a lot on, as we look at, and the agendas are organized usually by district area. So it's really important to me that the commissioners in each district pay particular attention to the items in their district, because, things that happen in northern Mojave County and the way the public perceives those items and those zoning changes and those development actions can be completely different than how the public might view or perceive or look at those actions that happen in the Kingman area or in Lake Havasu City. So to me, it's very valuable to me as a commissioner, but also when I was in each of your seats, to get that detailed feedback, because you live in your district, you drive those streets every day, you know the business owners and the residents in those districts. So it is really important that is why we're here, and especially in this diverse county as we deal with so many diverse, that's the one thing that I've really appreciated or was kind of surprised by or learned to appreciate the diversity that we have in Mojave County. And it does take a board like this with people from all over to really be able to understand each of those portions of the county. So I want to encourage that as we move forward, that each of you pay particular attention to the actions that are happening in your particular district, because I think everyone on this commission, will tend to lean on you as a commissioner in your district for your specific input and opinion on what's happening in that district or in that particular action that's going on in that district.
Mr. Chairman, I have a
Yes,
question.
Commissioner.
Does the staff go to the surrounding people when they are thinking about recommending a zoning change?
So, and that's a great question, a great point, and one I failed to mention. But one of the critical roles, sorry, lost my train of thought. One of the critical roles of this commission is to allow for that public input. It's to allow for the public hearing, and when we receive our application from the applicants, we don't have that public input at that point. So we prepare our recommendation based on the zoning ordinance and the general plan, and basically how that application ties in with our ordinances. So we prepare that, present it to you, and this meeting is that opportunity for those surrounding neighbors to come in and voice their opinion of that. This provides them that public hearing, and between our recommendation and then what you hear from the public is basically on you to make that determination of whether or not this is a good idea for that location. We will, to answer your question, we will go to the property. We post the property. We post the property, and then we also send out notices to the neighboring properties up to 300-foot radius of the property in order to make sure that they're noticed and aware of the public hearing and their opportunity to come in and voice their opinion of it. So.
And on top of that, in a lot of the actions, the applicant is required to hold a public neighborhood meeting, public meeting, and to a certain perimeter around the particular action. So there are a few opportunities for the public that the public are made aware either by staff or by the applicant, and are brought into the process and are aware of the process and can participate if they choose to.
Yeah, this commission has been very effective, and so has the Board of Supervisors, when a proposal is submitted that appears to generate a lot of public outcry or, both for and against the proposal. This commission has been very effective in requiring the applicant to go back and hold some public meetings to make sure that and that's a good idea, on these controversial issues that come up. It delays things, but it does assure that everybody in the area that's interested in the item gets an opportunity to provide their input.
Yeah, that's a good point, because they're definitely, even though they go through that process on the front end, a lot of times we see the public doesn't participate in that initial, either they can't or they're not available to participate. All of a sudden, they're here at this hearing, really getting involved for the first time. And like you pointed out, we have had a number of times where we've said, okay, obviously not enough people were involved, and it makes it difficult for us to make a decision with that uncertainty within the neighborhood and the public. So we have requested that they go back and hold an additional meeting to try and garner some consensus as to what the neighbors are looking for.
And when you have a proposal for zoning, like Tim says, the neighbors within 300 feet, property owners with a 300-foot radius of the property are notified because they occupy a special position in the zoning decision. If 20% of the number and area, and sometimes it's hard to figure out, but staff usually does it pretty good, protest the zoning, then it can't be approved unless it's by a supermajority of the Board of Supervisors, which is practically a unanimous decision at the
4/5.
Yeah, 4/5. So, and but that's not, your recommendation isn't subject to a supermajority. Just the board's ultimate decision is. So it's important that we get those the people within 300 feet, and get their input and see where that's going to shake out. In fact, I think that happened in
His last meeting.
yeah.
Yeah, I was there.
So, like a general plan, a proposed zoning change is legislative. You have a lot of discretion to consider. You should, go by rely on staff's recommendation as to how it fits with the statutes and things like that. If you have any questions, you can always call either one of the staff members or call me. I'm here to advise you and help you work through some of these things. But you have a lot of discretion, a lot more than you would in an administrative action, to make your recommendation, to condition your recommendation to the board on certain things that you see come up, such as the one we had recently where it was recommended that it go forward, except that no mobile homes will be allowed, or manufactured homes will be allowed. So you do have authority to based on your knowledge of the area and stuff, to make a recommendation, to recommend certain conditions to go along with your recommendation to the board. As for administrative action, we did an amendment to, or rewrote practically the zoning ordinance. It's been about 4 or 5 years now, and have reduced the amount of administrative action that comes to the commission and then to the board. A lot of that is performed in-house, but there are still some things that come to the commission and board that is more like administrative action. And one of them involves the development of subdivisions. We'll get a plat review, and I think that still comes, plat review
Just to the board.
It comes from staff to the board. It used, until we amended the zoning ordinance, it would come through the commission. But as an example of how, and it might come back, who knows, the zoning ordinance may be amended again, and some of this could come back. But a subdivision plat review doesn't require as much discretion. It's basically a check to see that that all the requirements that are provided under the enabling statute for subdivision development, that's ARS 11-821, that all those requirements are met. The county is very limited in what it can impose on subdivision development, adequate streets, utilities, things like that. A letter of assurance of water supply from ADWR, but the discretion in reviewing subdivision plats is very limited. And I guess this is another question that I would have for Tim. When we have a petition for exceptions, since that requires, that would be more of a legislative action, because it does require, the change of policy or things like that. Would that come to the commission then, or does that go straight to the board?
Carl, that still goes to the board, correct?
Petitions of exception for improvements go to the board. Petitions of exception for minor design requirements are handled internally.
Oh, okay. So,
They heard that.
yeah, but that would be an example of where subdivision plat review becomes legislative rather than administrative. Use permits are kind of a mixed bag. And we saw a use permit come through you guys and then to the board that was legislative in action, because you had the discretion to consider. Some use permits, we had one that went to court, it's been about 5 or 6 years ago, where somebody proposed an RV park development on property down in Lake Havasu. And there, an RV park was a permitted use under the current zoning classification, and it was our position that that the granting of the RV park, the review of the RV park plan and granting of the RV park was an administrative action, because it was just to check to see if adequate streets, parking, and stuff like that, they're all spelled out in the statute. That was challenged. They tried to subject the approval to a referendum, and that was challenged, and we actually took it to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals agreed that since the RV park was a permitted use already, that the review to make sure that it complied with the technical requirements for the establishment of an RV park was an administrative action, and the voters couldn't overturn that. So that's an example of the distinction. If there's some use permits require public input, such as the one you more recently saw, that would be legislative action, because you're considering not just what's in the ordinance and whether or not it complies with the ordinance, but its impact on the neighborhood. Does it require a change in zoning? Things like that. So some use permits would be legislative rather than administrative. I think since we redid the zoning ordinance, that most of the stuff that you guys are going to get is going to be legislative in nature, so where you have more discretion to consider input and things like that. So is there any questions on the distinction between administrative and legislative action?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Not about this current subject, but one that was covered prior.
Okay.
A lot of the times when staff recommends that something passes, we are not told what the amendments are. Any way that could be corrected?
You're saying, are you asking about, once the board approves it, what additional amendments they've added?
What your staff just recommends, but then there's a list of things that have to go along with it, is where we don't hear the list.
Okay. Generally, I think I understand, but generally when we make a recommendation, We'll have a list of standard conditions that we'll include with that recommendation, and I think you'll sometime hear, recommend approval with standard conditions. And then those conditions, they're listed in there, but we could, if it would help, we could go through those standard conditions when we make that recommendation.
That may help our decision, though.
Okay. Yeah, we'd be happy to.
They are specifically provided, though, in the agenda packet.
They are in the agenda packet,
So it would be easy enough for staff to read through them, there might be some that you might have some particular questions about,
Yeah.
and staff could more fully explain those.
Very
Staff and I are here to help you, so, however we can do that, we'd be glad to, so. So I guess now we can go into some of the items that really apply to any public body, open meeting law, conflict of interest, that sort of thing.
Mr. Taylor, before we do, can I ask one other follow-up question on the general plan and zoning ordinance? And this is probably, you mentioned it earlier, but for Mr. Walsh, when I know we've gone through, it's been a few years now, the general plan update and the zoning ordinance updates, when are we slated to have to go back through that process?
I believe, let me pull them up
Be
real
every 10
quick.
years in the
I-
statute.
Yeah, I think it's every 10 years, and I believe the last time it was done was 2015. Let me pull it up real quick just to make sure.
November of 2015 for the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
Okay.
So it's every 10 years that they're
Okay, so-
updated, and they were just updated in 2015,
Yeah.
so.
So we're almost halfway towards that. Okay, we have some time. Thank you.
Okay, for open meeting law, under ARS 38-431 and then the successive statutes, a public body is required to conduct its meetings in an openly. A meeting is defined as a gathering of a quorum of the public body, either in person or through technological devices, during which legal action is either discussed or taken. So it's important, the Planning and Zoning Commission is appointed by the Board of Supervisors, and it is therefore a public body subject to the open meeting law. It falls under the definition of a public body, and subject to the open meeting law requirements. And the meetings must be held in public, and you can only discuss and take action on what is properly noticed in the agenda. A lot of times you'll have a call to the public as part of your meeting. Your role in a call to the public is to just take the public comments. You may direct staff to look into it, but you shouldn't discuss, whether or not you think it's a good idea, whether the quality of it, anything like that, because you may be having that very discussion in an open meeting as it should be held, subsequently. But you're certainly, I think the current Board of Supervisors has encouraged public bodies to hold a call to the public to assure that we do get public input. But just remember, your role in the call to the public is not to take action on or even discuss, the quality of the proposal. You can direct staff to look into it, and that's about it. There are a few things that you have to watch out for in assuring that you're complying with the open meeting law requirements. One common sin is to split the quorum. You can't circumvent the open meeting laws by discussing with less than a quorum. 3 or 4 of you get together, this is a good idea, and then you go on and you gather some more members of the commission and discuss it with them, either email or whatever, and until you've discussed it as a quorum, that would be a violation of the open meeting law. So, I think it's okay for you guys to discuss things between, less than a quorum of you. A couple of you that are from the same district, may have an interest in discussing, but make sure that you don't split the quorum and patch in a quorum. Bring your discussions and your recommendations either to staff to include in your knowledge of a particular development, either to staff to include in the agenda packet, or bring it in to the public meeting. Another area of concern is the use of social media and technology. Everybody has Facebook and Twitter and all this type of stuff. be careful when you're using those devices. You may contact each other, you may contact staff about a question that you have. Don't hit copy all and get the rest of the commission in. That would be a violation of the open meeting law. One of the things that you could do if you have a particular question about a proposed development or something is contact staff, and they can include your question or something in the agenda packet. So, but just be careful about inadvertently patching in a quorum of the commission in any of your technological devices.
Bob, just real quick, that goes even as far as when Dina sends out her request to know who will be there. Really, it should just be reply straight back to Dina and not reply all, correct?
That would be the safest. I mean, technically, just stating whether or not you can make a meeting would not be a discussion of a matter that you're going to take legal action on. So, in a lot of instances, it wouldn't be a violation, but it's so easy, to inadvertently, you copy all. I mean, one of the commissioners might say, "This is a good idea. I can't wait till we discuss it," or something, and you copy all, and then you've already got someone making a comment on how they think it's good. So that could be a problem. But it's better to like when you get communication from staff about meetings and attendance and things like that. It's better to just reply to that staff member, and they'll coordinate and make sure that they got a sufficient number of commissioners that are going to be at a meeting, and if you have questions about a particular item, contact the staff member. You can contact them in email, but just don't copy all of the commission. With your anything that you want to discuss with the rest of the commission should be done here in the open forum. Another area that, in some instances, it may apply to a planning and zoning commission decision is ex parte communications. Basically, an ex parte communication means an oral or written communication on the merits of an issue, like an action that might be taken. That was not in the open records, and that was not presented to all parties that might have a potential interest in the issue. It's basically applies to a judicial proceeding. It's not fair for the judge to allow one party in an action to communicate about the merits of a lawsuit or something like that without having the other party there to hear and defend their position. But the Planning and Zoning Commission is more of a legislative body rather than a judicial, quasi-judicial body. But you still should follow the general principle behind avoiding ex parte communications. And to be clear, though, you guys are chosen from your respective districts because your knowledge of the constituents there, the way property is developed and stuff like that. So you undoubtedly be contacted by people that have a development proposal coming through. And I think it's entirely appropriate for you to take communication from that person and take written materials and whatever. But remember that you act not only as a representative of your condition, of your respective district, you operate as a body, not as individual commissioners. So when you have particular knowledge, or you have written communication or whatever that you think should be included in the rest of the commission's decision, submit it to staff if you get it soon enough that it can be included in the agenda packet. That's the best way to go. And if not, if it's a last-minute thing, bring it and bring copies for everybody, if it's a written communication, so that every member of the commission can have the ability to see what what it is and whether or not they can go along with it, and also so that the public can know what sort of communications are submitted out there, so that they can address it. The public's involved in this as well.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, go ahead, Commissioner Jacks.
I'd like to, just for information, still being relatively new on the commission, has this come up very much in the past with members that have served for a while, where you get inputs basically on the street or in your neighborhood on an issue that's going to come before the commission?
We had it happen a few years, a couple of years ago, where one of the commissioners, not someone that's presently on the commission, had apparently, voluminous written material on a proposal and was in support of it, and that commissioner's statement in the meeting was, I've reviewed this, I think it's, I've gotten reports and stuff, but that report wasn't submitted to the rest of the commission. So, it's okay to take the communications, but remember the rest of the commission and the public should be privy to those communications as well.
Yeah, so it's happened a couple of times, but I think what Mr. Taylor's saying is important, just to note that when that stuff comes in, when you receive those information, share that with staff so they can share it with everybody and everybody's aware and not blindsided at a hearing by something that, people aren't aware of.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question on the oral communication. Should a party approach you and discuss something orally with you, he doesn't have anything in writing, what is your recommendation for us handling the oral? Do we recommend they write something and turn it into the staff, or do we, if they're not willing to do that, at that point, do we need to, make note of it and turn it into the staff?
I think that you can, depending on the circumstances, you can do either. If the applicant or the person from your district says, I think that you need to consider this, you can say, well, you can submit it to staff, so it can be, jot down a memo or something and submit it to staff. If for some reason that appears impractical, or they're not willing to do that, but you still think the communication should go to the rest of the commission, then you should contact, you can email the staff, and they'll see that it gets in the agenda packet. But that's another one of those instances where you don't copy everybody, just get it in the agenda package.
Thank you.
So depending on how comfortable, whichever way feels more practical and comfortable for you, that if you can get oral communications, get it early enough that it can be put in the agenda packet, I think that would be a good idea.
Okay, thank you.
I've typically always tried to encourage that public member to, get their statements out, via email, phone call to staff, letter, whatever the case might be. So it's on record and it's not just coming, secondhand through the commissioner. Kind of takes you out of that position. But if you feel like there's something being said and it might not get passed on, then I would suggest getting that to staff, and either just a phone call or an email saying, here's what I heard, or here's what, is being said. I don't know if staff's heard this yet. I don't know if you will, but I think it's important for people to hear what I'm hearing.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, I have a
Yes.
question. One of your lines here, splitting the quorum, I'll just read the last part. Until you have discussed the matter with a quorum outside of an open meeting. Would you comment on that? How many people
Well,
can be involved in discussing something without, we got 10 commissioners.
you got 10 commissioners, you cannot go over a majority of the commissioners. So you have 6, you can't discuss it with 6 commissioners outside.
What about if there's only 8 commissioners? Would it be, again, the majority?
It's of any group.
Yeah, I guess the question is probably if in the past we've not had 10 full commissioners, we've had 8 or 9. So it's just a majority, right, of the currently sitting number of commissioners?
Well, some action and there's variance of opinion in that respect. If your commission is defined as a 10-member commission, there are some instances where you need to, if you don't have enough members on the commission to constitute a majority of that 10-member commission, then you can't take action. There are some actions and there are some opinions that if you have a 10-member commission and several of them resign or you lose some of them, in order for the public body to not be deadlocked, that a recommendation of a majority of the remaining commission members would be sufficient. And again, you know, if we do come, hopefully, we'll never get back to that position again. It's been very rare that we've been,
Short, yeah.
yeah, but if we do, and that's something that probably I'll work with staff or something, you know, if there's some issues that come up, so that we can see that, you know, is it something that we can take, even bring to the. you know, we
Mr.
don't-
Taylor, my
Generally speaking,
question
if
more
you're-
direct is, if I had something on the agenda, can I call Mr. Gordon and talk to Mr. Gordon about it if we see each other? Where does it limit me to how many I can talk to about that item
Well, you can't.
and split a quorum?
You can't call Mr. Gordon and talk with him, and then he calls Mr. Powers, and Mr. Powers calls a couple of his friends, and pretty soon the whole commission has discussed it. That's what you got to be careful about, you know, but,
But ultimately, he could speak to, in essence, less than half or less than half of the commission.
Right, and-
Before he has created a quorum on that particular item.
right, you can't, he might not create a quorum, but you keep.
If others discuss it, it does,
Yeah,
yes.
so, you
Yeah.
know, that could be a problem. So it's, you know, you should talk with, you know, particularly those of you that are in the same district and stuff, that you might, you know, have special knowledge. You know, I think it's perfectly okay to talk about something that's coming up, but just be careful, and maybe even, you know, if both of you keep in mind that, okay, we've got to limit our discussions about this.
Right.
Question. Okay, I understand what you're saying, but also too, you just got through saying 5 or 10 minutes ago, the whole board's supposed to know what's going on. Well, how do you separate the two?
Well, the whole board, you get a communication, you get it to staff so that it can be included in the agenda packet. That way, the discussion takes place in the open forum. You don't go
So
behind
it's,
that.
so basically, it's a word private that is missing.
It has
out
to
of the
be,
Conversation. Say, as whether Michael and I have a private conversation,
Right,
and then it goes on down the line, but, that the whole board doesn't know about it.
right,
But then at the meeting, the whole thing is exposed.
right, and that's an
Okay,
open
all right.
meeting, because
Right.
I mean, that's the whole purpose. It's to, you know, all these odd open meeting law requirements are to make sure that you don't deliberate behind, you know, and make a decision as a board, or deliberate about making a decision as a board, except here where everybody can see it. That's-
so it either needs to be discussed in the open public meeting or provided to staff so it can be part of the public communication.
Right.
So there's nothing ever discussed or hidden behind the scenes, so to speak.
Right.
Commissioner Powers.
Mr. Taylor, I have possibly a dumb question. If somebody has something on the agenda and they're angry with my decision, whether it was a motion or a second or a vote, and they approach me one-on-one, and they're very angry, how do I handle that?
Well, you can answer their questions, and you might, again, I would convey that, if it's something substantive or something like that, you know, convey it to staff so that they can determine whether or not that should be in the agenda packet, you know. If you, I mean, you probably will be approached by people in your district, you know, one way or the other, that are happy about something or unhappy about something. So you just, you know, handle it with tact, you explain your role, and you explain where it will be discussed. You know, tell them, we're going to have a meeting on this, bring your concerns to the meeting. You know,
And
if-
it's
if
that,
they-
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
If it's after a decision, you know, we're just recommending, your vote's just a recommendation. Ultimately, the decision's going to be made by the Board of Supervisors, so you can always pass it off on that and say, well, that's, unfortunately, that's how I feel.
Blame it on
That's
the
how I
board.
voted, but I don't get the final say, and if you don't, if you don't agree, you know, you can go to the Board of Supervisors.
That's why they get the big bucks.
Well, and as a quasi-legislative body, you do enjoy immunity, you know, I mean, people are going to, you know, threaten you with lawsuits or, well, I don't know, I don't think that happens very often, but, you know, I mean, they certainly, you know, can't, you enjoy immunity. You're making a recommendation, and it's a legislative function, so, you know, that you can't be held, you know, financially liable for your legislative recommendation.
Can I ask if this has happened to anybody on the board? here?
Yes, I've had people call me and be upset about it, and my answer is, you know, we, as a board, hear everything. We hear what the public has, we hear what staff has, and we make a recommendation to the board, and they're the one makes the final decision. I'm sorry if you don't like the way it came out, but that's just the way it is. And I've never had anything go beyond that. And I've had it happen. I've been on the board a good part of 14 years, so I've never had it happen and got in trouble. I've had it happen a number of times.
Commissioner
Mr. Chairman,
Gillette, yes.
May I make a statement?
Absolutely.
I've been through several classes on the open law, meeting law, and my personal thing is I don't discuss anything with any of the other board members for the very simple reason that you discuss it with one, that one discusses it with another, and it's a chain reaction.
That's splitting the quorum then.
Can't go wrong that way.
No, you can't. You can't.
If in doubt, don't.
Sounds good. Thank you for the input on that.
Okay, okay, then another area about open meeting law is the executive sessions. ARS 38-431.03 provides limited exceptions for, to discuss business outside of the open forum. And they're known as executive sessions. But you have the choice to vote, it takes a majority vote to go into executive session. The one that's most applicable, you know, to your body, and that has happened quite frequently, is executive sessions to discuss, to consult with your attorney regarding legal advice, and that could be, you know, legal implications of anything that's on the agenda, or discussion with your attorney if there's a threatened litigation. Frequently, we hear things like, oh, you're going to subject yourself to Prop 207 litigation or something. If you want to discuss those things outside of the open meeting, you can vote, and a majority of you can vote, and we can take it into the executive session. You know, the purpose for that is that, you know, when I'm advising you, I want to be candid about the strengths and weaknesses of your position. I don't want to expose any weaknesses that might be exploited, and give you a frank opinion. You know, that's one of the tenets behind, you know, the confidentiality of legal advice. That applies generally everywhere. So those are the two sessions either. That would be most applicable for you to go into executive session. If you had legal questions that you would like to discuss, or if, you know, we're getting threatened with litigation or something, you would like to discuss the merits of that threat. So remember during an executive session that what is discussed in the executive session is confidential. It's part of the attorney-client confidence. And also remember that in the discussions in the executive session, you just take advice. We can discuss, you can ask questions, and I could provide answers and take advice. You can't vote, you can't determine what you're going to do in the executive session. You bring the deliberations out here after the executive session and make your vote. It's just basically it's almost like a workshop in the executive session. You can ask me specific questions, and I can provide legal advice and stuff, but don't get into you know, discussing whether or not you think it's a good proposal or anything like that. You know, bring that out here and do it in an open meeting.
I don't recall the commission on their own entering into executive session very often, but we have had a few instances where staff requests or suggests an executive session because the item may have some litigation or may have some insight that Mr. Taylor wants us to be aware of before we discuss it and before we ultimately make a decision. So that's come up a few times recently, but
Yeah, a lot of times staff will request it. You know,
Yeah.
they'll ask me, do you think we ought to do this in executive session? I'll say it's a good idea, but the decision whether or not to go into the executive session is yours.
Yeah.
You can decide, no, let's do this in open. You know.
yeah.
So, another area of concern is conflicts of interest. As a public body, you know, as a public officer, as a member of a public body, if you or a relative have a substantial interest in a decision to be made or a recommendation to be made, you have to make known that interest in the records, you know, declare your conflict of interest and refrain from participating in the discussion. The conflicts of interest, it has several technical defined terms. A substantial interest is defined as any pecuniary or proprietary interest that does not fit under one of the defined remote interests. So it has to be many of you are involved in businesses and trades and things like that, you have an interest in what's going on, but do you have a specific, you know, pecuniary interest? You have knowledge about real estate development, things like that. You may you may have an interest, you know, that, well, you know, this zoning change may benefit me, you know, but you have to look at whether or not it's, you know, do you really have a pecuniary interest? And there are several exceptions that are defined as remote interests. One of them that would probably would be most applicable to the decisions you're involved in. A remote, I think there's about 13 different types of things that are defined as remote interest, meaning that you can go ahead, even though it might benefit you somewhat financially, you can go ahead and participate in it. The one that I see that comes up most often is if your interest is that of a member of a trade, business, occupation, or profession, or class of persons consisting of at least 10 members, and that your interest is no greater than the other members of that trade, business, or occupation, or profession, or class of people. You know, what that means is, you know, like if you're involved in real estate development or something like that, somebody brings a requested zoning change, it may have, or a change in a text amendment to the zoning ordinance that may have a beneficial, either beneficial or detrimental impact on your occupation. There's certainly more than 10 members of the development community or 10 members of the real estate community. So it's okay for you to enjoy that benefit if it generally applies across the board. If it's a proposal or something that specifically benefits your development, you know, such as a zoning change, you know, in the area where you have an interest, or you have some financial interest in the specific, you know, development going forward, then it would probably be wouldn't fit the definition of remote. But if it's a general, it's most often seen, some of you will get involved in the when we get back around to redoing the zoning ordinance or a general plan amendment, when we get back around to that, it's going to be about 14 years or something.
That will be
5 years or
about
something
5
like
years.
that. Then you can get involved in that, you know, because those don't apply to specific developments and stuff. It's just, it may either help you or hurt you if it's adopted, but it applies evenly across the board to members of your trade or occupation. So it's okay. That would be determined to be a remote interest. And remember, and a lot of these exceptions, that's the one that you would probably most often see. You know, I've gotten a lot of questions. How could, you know, through my years here, how, you know, he's a real estate developer, or he's a subdivision developer or somewhere, you know, he can't vote on this because he has a conflict of interest. Well, if it's a generally applicable proposal, then there wouldn't be a conflict of interest. But if it applies to a person's specific development, then it would be a conflict. And what you do at that point, or the relative, and relative is a defined term too. And generally, it you know, goes to you know, husbands, wives, parents, and brothers and sisters, and things like that. You know, it doesn't stretch on forever. What I would encourage you to do if you suspect that you have a conflict of interest is to give me a call and let's talk about it. And, you know, I can go through all the exceptions with you and explain them in more detail and see if your interest might be considered a remote interest. I could also, if you have a question about, you know, a relative's involvement in a project, I can address it with you that way too. And the way to avoid problems is when you do have a conflict, or what you're required to do is to make sure that you get a declaration of that conflict in the records. and refrain from participation. What I've seen people do is they'll just, I have a conflict, I'll refrain from this, and they'll go around, behind the into the break room and wait till they're called back out while it's discussed. That's probably a pretty safe course there. So I think I've covered everything that I had on my map. Is there anything that you guys,
I'd
some
really
other discussion.
appreciate the kind of the thorough review. I think that's a good refresher for all of us, including especially the new commissioners on all of those items. So thank you for that. Did any of the commissioners have any follow-up questions, comments on what Mr. Taylor covered?
and it's generally hard to cover all the stuff that applies in a 1-hour meeting and a 3-page memo, but, so, I guess I'm just sort of introducing you to the problems and the most likely problems to come up. But if you have any questions, that I'm here, just give me a call or email me, and I'll be glad to discuss any specific questions that you have as we move forward, through the future meetings.
Well, I appreciate that, and that's one thing I did want to say. Both Mr. Taylor and Mr. Walsh and all of their staff, I've found have been, as thorough as they are in their staff reports and the information they provide us, they're definitely very, very available to all of the commissioners. So as was suggested numerous times, if there's ever questions, concern over what you may or may not be doing, or if you should abstain or not, by all means, reach out to them directly, and they'll walk you through the proper way to handle that situation. So thank you for that. That's what we had on the agenda from Mr. Taylor and Mr. Walsh. We do have an item to basically discuss any other comments, announcements. I know in the past at times we've had the discussion of should we, some commissioners have made statements about this particular item we should look into, or look at the ordinance on this particular item. If anybody has anything that they'd like to discuss regarding any of the ordinances, we can do that. If there's anything commissioners would like to ask staff to look into and bring back to us, we can, we can certainly bring that up today as well. So if there is anything, feel free. If not, Mr. Walsh, Mr. Taylor, do you have anything else today for us?
I think that's all we
Okay.
have, yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank everyone, first, again, for our new commissioners, and for almost having everyone here on a meeting that, didn't have any scheduled events originally. So thank you for your participation today. I think it was important and valuable for everybody. And again, appreciate the staff putting this together and the thoroughness of the discussion. That being said, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
A motion and a second. Those in favor?
Aye.
We stand adjourned. Have a good day.